Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Picture of Dorian Gray. Today we're going to be focusing on chapters 1 and 2, some basic summary and analysis to kind of help you and guide you through your readings. Before we get started, I just wanted to reiterate that I hope you guys are doing well during this whole social isolation thing, and that if you have any questions or concerns, please email me. I'll be sure to help you out as best as I can. So, just give you a little background information on what we covered and what we'll cover today. In the past week, we focused more on the context. Who is Oscar Wilde? The preface where he addressed some things and some idioms and things like art for art's sake, the aesthetic movement, the hedonist movement, and how that influences the text. So today we're going to jump into the actual text itself and cover chapters 1 and 2. So starting out, the way I'll be structuring this lecture is focused on relations between characters. I feel that when you structure it between the relationship between, for example, Basil and Lord Henry, or Lord Henry and Dorian, Basil and Dorian, such as that, it's easier to understand kind of the influence that each other have, as well as it gives a better theme for what exactly Oscar Wilde is trying to say. One could argue that a lot of what Oscar Wilde, his philosophies, is based off of what Lord Henry says. And we'll talk a little bit about whether Lord Henry believes them or not is kind of a separate topic, but rather we can get these ideas of hedonism and aestheticism through Lord Henry. So kind of their relationships between each other and what role each other play definitely makes the novel an easier story to kind of digest. So first, in chapter 1, we have two characters. We have Basil Hallward and Lord Henry Wotton. So first, let's talk about Basil. Basil, he's an artist who paints Dorian. Pretty straightforward. He's infatuated with Dorian. He claims that his art he's put too much of himself in an art, therefore he can't show it to the public. Art shown to the public is supposed to be something pretty, something to look at, but if the struggle with the artist and the art is that if you put too much of yourself in it, people can see more of the artist than the actual painting itself. Which is kind of ironic if you think about it. One could argue that this, in fact, is a story about Oscar Wilde to a certain extent, where he's talking about some of his own philosophies. So the fact that Basil is saying, I don't know if I should show this to the public because it's a reflection of me, could possibly be Oscar Wilde saying the same thing, saying that art for art's sake is the ideal. However, when writing, it's very difficult to create that distance. The fancy literary term for that would be aesthetic distance, separating the writer from the art, or the artist from the artwork. So he mentions that. He painted a picture of Dorian, however, it shows too much of himself, therefore he doesn't want to show anyone to the public. And then Lord Henry doesn't really buy that, and he goes, no, give me a better reason. And so what he says is, fine, I don't want to share this view of Dorian, it's too perfect. And then lastly, we see that Basil doesn't buy into Lord Henry's philosophies. That's very important, because Basil is going to act as almost this rational character, this person that can observe what's happening from a rational standpoint. Of course, he's got some of his biases. He's attracted to Dorian, and whether it's an artistic sense or a different sense, it's kind of irrelevant. But the fact that Basil is attracted to Dorian and can be that rational character is kind of a good framework to understand this character. So next we'll talk about Lord Henry Wotton. He's definitely going to be an interesting character through this story. He's a philosopher who influences through psychology and words. So the fact that he's a philosopher and uses words as a way to influence people is definitely an interesting dynamic based off of what he claims. So let's talk about some of the things that he claims. Well, first, he believes in the hedonistic and aesthetic mindset. However, let's call into question something. Does he actually believe this concept. Because he claims to follow the hedonistic, do whatever feels right mentality, and there is no such thing as moral or immoral philosophy. All of philosophy is immoral. Therefore, we should just indulge in that everything is beautiful, or everything should be for the sake of beauty, which goes against a lot of things that he has in his life. For example, he believes that monogamy is pointless. However, he's married. He mentions that he's allowed to lie to his wife, and his wife lies to him, but she's a better liar, and he always gets caught, and they laugh, and then they move on their day, which seems very twisted. It seems incredibly immoral, yet they're okay with it. Now, one can call into question whether Henry actually does that, or is it just a thought experiment? Is his philosophy simply an influence on someone else to see how it works? Which again is completely immoral, yet we start seeing that with Dorian, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. He also mentions that values or thought is superficial. That beauty, yes, is superficial, but it's not as superficial as thought. So does he view his philosophies as rather thought experiments on what would happen if, as opposed to an actual life to be lived? Because he doesn't partake to the extreme, but yet encourages some to do so. He then begs, or Basil begs Lord Henry to not influence Dorian if they meet. Again, Dorian represents this idea of innocence, this idea of purity at this point. Therefore, Basil doesn't buy into the ideologies of Henry and says, hey, if you meet Dorian, don't influence him. He's too perfect. He doesn't want Henry to corrupt him. So the last thing to really keep in mind between Basil and Henry is that they contrast each other. Basil and Henry are both infatuated with Dorian, yet one is influential and the other one is observational. Meaning, Henry influences Dorian, whereas Basil is simply observing the beauty. How might that play into the story is something we want to continue to look at. How do their character representations tell about how they interact with this idea of innocence? So then we go on to chapter 2. He tells Lord Henry to leave, yet just as it would happen, and it's a bit comical, Dorian walks in. And so Lord Henry meets Dorian, and so that's what we'll be talking about with chapter 2. So let's talk a little bit about Dorian first, since we've talked about Lord Henry. So Dorian, he's known as the most beautiful young man. He's ideally perfect. He's described as a Grecian god. He's described as mythological. He's shown as this state of perfection. He's young, he's impressionable, but he's perfect. He's a symbol of innocence. What does that mean? It means that throughout the story, we want to look at this precursor Dorian, because he is a dynamic character, meaning changing throughout the novel. We want to look at this beginning Dorian as this sense of innocence, this sense of perfect in every way, and how does that change? We then have this interesting dynamic that not only is Lord Henry infatuated with Dorian, but Dorian becomes infatuated with Lord Henry through his words. At the beginning, we see that Basil and Dorian's relationship is almost monotonous. He comes over, sits, gets tired of it because Basil won't communicate with him, yet Basil paints him, and then they leave. However, when he meets Henry, there's an infatuation because he speaks. His words are eloquent. His words are beautiful, which paints towards this idea of how words can really influence someone. And then we see this major shift from the Dorian before the influences of Henry or Harry, they're interchangeable, Basil calls him Harry, to the after effects of the influences. We see this innocence become this impressionable kid to someone that's been impressed upon. So now let's talk about those influences. What did Henry say to Dorian to make him so infatuated? And does Dorian take hold of that ideology? So first he mentions that the highest of all duties is the duty that one owes to oneself. What does that mean? Basically what he's saying is that the only job of a person's life is to do the things that is owed to him. When you have the chance to do something that will benefit you, you act upon it. What is that? Hedonism. And Dorian has never seen that before. He's impressed upon that. He wants to know what that's about. And so when they decide to take a little break in the garden and he hears more about that, he becomes more infatuated with his words. Remember, Henry's words are very elaborate. He speaks in paragraphs if you look at the page. And so being swept on these images of beauty and nature and philosophy, one can then see the appeal of hedonism. Remember that relationship, aestheticism, hedonism. This may intrigue Dorian because he's never viewed himself as anything spectacular, yet he realizes the inherent privilege that he has. He's never seen himself as someone that can utilize what he's been given. He knows he's beautiful, he's been told he's beautiful, but what does that mean? What can that do for him other than just be him? When Lord Henry gives him a tool or a framework to capitalize on that beauty, he then becomes more interested. We then have another quote where he tells Dorian that his youth and beauty will eventually fade. He's at the perfect time in his life where people enjoy seeing him, they enjoy looking at him. Therefore, he should spend this time always searching for a new sensation. He should always be looking for how do I capitalize on this, because in a short time that will not be the case. The one humorous quote is when he's talking about married men or young men versus old men. He goes, "Those who have the opportunity to be faithless remain faithful, and those who have to be faithful desire to be faithless." What he's saying is when a man is young and he has the chance to and the beauty to seduce women or seduce someone else, they don't, because they desire to have this lifelong love. Whereas when a man grows older and he desires, okay, I want something new, he has no chance because an old man cannot seduce someone young. And so it's this ironic play of what you can do when you don't capitalize on it. He also mentions this idea of people being infatuated with lifelong relationships, and they negate the desire. He says caprice, which means like momentary fling. And he goes, everyone negates the caprice because they want the lifelong love. Ironically, though, the caprice lasts longer than someone that's looking for a lifelong love. What he's saying here is people look for love, yet, however, due to one thing or another, it fades. Therefore, why not enjoy the fiery passion than the stability of faithfulness? So what we have here is this idea of maybe carpe diem. What does that mean? It's Latin for seize the day. So Lord Henry is telling Dorian, you have this opportunity, seize it, indulge in it. And what happens because you only have a moment to experience it. Dorian's recognition of this fleeting youth causes hatreds toward the painting once the painting is done. He looks and goes, how dare that painting be able to experience the youth forever, yet I cannot. I would give my soul to swap places with this painting, where the painting would grow old and I would remain young. That's foreshadowing. What Oscar Wilde is doing here is foreshadowing this turn of events. It's also an allusion. A lot of people take it to the superstitious tale of Faustus, where a guy sells his soul to the devil to forever remain young. Although Dorian is not doing that necessarily, it's echoing that idea of what I would not give for eternal youth. Dorian falls into this ideology of Lord Henry and desires to learn more. This is the shift. He's been indoctrinated and intoxicated by the words of Lord Henry that he wants to know more and kind of disregards anything Basil wants. That's where we see that shift from Lord Henry being influential and Basil becoming this observational character. Dorian's shift in mentality is the rise of the aesthetic and hedonist lifestyle that Henry preaches yet does not necessarily follow. So what we're going to look at throughout the rest of this novel is how do these ideology come into play? How does the influence of Henry at the beginning create what Dorian becomes? And why isn't Henry becoming what Dorian becomes? He preaches philosophy or immorality, yet he lives a pretty stable life. Does he not believe what he says? Is he so infatuated with words that he does not care what influence those words have? Maybe this is a story about how words and influence is so powerful, yet we don't realize the extent in which they have on someone. So that's where we'll stop today. Next week we'll go into a few more chapters of the book and analyze it. But what I want you to pay attention during these 2 chapters is focus on the relationships and some of these sayings of Lord Henry. How does what he says not match up to what he does? And also, what are the implications of some of the wild things he says about faithfulness and marriage and immorality and words? And how is there truth to it? Or is it rather a twisted take on reality? All right, I'll see you guys next week. Have a great weekend.